Hey guys, it's FugLy, also known as 944. Don't forget Thorin's YouTube channel.
Right, this is going to be another episode of Reflections. My guest for this one is going to be Daps, who is the current coach of Team Liquid, but obviously is better known as the in-game leader of teams like NRG, maybe if you're really old school, certain other teams, but we'll get into that. So where I want to start this interview, Daps, is normally I nearly always ask everyone in CSGO who played in the early days, like, what were you doing in 1.6 or Source or whatever? And one thing I found was interesting was, I know you were like around the invite level of 1.6, but you weren't a top player. I remember back then, you weren't someone like I knew the name of. But one thing I noticed was you weren't that young actually, dude. Like I noticed like when you really got going in CSGO, you're already in your 20s, you know, like what was the 1.6 time like for you? Were you thinking you were a semi-pro? Were you thinking you were going to be pro? What was this time period like?
I mean, I dabbled in sort of like every game. Like I started playing in 2006, and I was more like casual. And I honestly, Source ended up being my main game eventually,
right,
because I was like the main thing that got me into competitive was like the CGS and just watching like if you remember the XFX tour bus and like Mikey Tux and Hackshot and like all those old names and stuff, and it was just like, oh wow, this is like super cool. I didn't know people could make money from video games in like any sense, because I was just a person who did like surf servers and gun game and stuff.
Ah, right.
Yeah,
very casual, basically. Sure.
Yeah, super casual, and then just like I saw that in like the YouTube videos and watched CGS, and that's where I sort of got into Cal League. And by the end of like Source, ended up just fully transitioning to Source and just stopping 1.6. And right at the end, when I finally made invite in Cal, the whole website went down, and then it completely just disappeared. And then I played like ESEA a little bit, but yeah, that was pretty much the beginning before CSGO.
When did you become like a leader in the game? When did IGL become your role?
I'd say when I started playing with like, what was the team name? It was like with Mozbek and Wabbit and Juvenile. It was like the team before.
Oh, so this is just like an invite level team, basically. These are people would know if you know ESEA back in the day.
Yeah, because like my IGL before was E-Mode, who was old.
Oh, okay, yeah, very old one, yeah, sure.
Yeah, and when we were on this like pug team, pretty much, no one really knew how to call really well, and I felt like I had a better read on the game, and that's sort of like where I started trying to IGL, essentially.
Would you say you're someone who, in this role, did you commit early on? Were you someone who thought, like, maybe I'll just do it on this team and then I'll switch over and I'll just be a player elsewhere? Because to me, I've often seen the role as, even though some people, I'll give them props if they manage it, can be IGL for like a year and someone else takes turns. I do kind of see it as one of the roles you have to sort of hard commit to. I think it's a bit like ARPA. So if you're going to do it, you probably should do it all out and try and just be the absolute best.
I'd say I pretty much committed out the gate, because I didn't stop being an IGL after that. Like, at the start, I was kind of upset because I was pretty like stat driven, like very early on in my career. Like I was more of like a baiting player, like not going first ever, playing clutches, and essentially sometimes even at the start when I was calling, I would just like send people in to die, and then I would just play like post plants and stuff. So overall, I just kind of like started to learn that I had to be more selfless in that time period, and that's where I sort of just fully committed to the role.
Sure. So, okay, one of the stories a lot of people won't know, believe it or not, Daps, because people just do such a bad job doing the narratives in esports. People probably think we now just skip and start talking about Team Liquid into, you know, like the later squads. What they won't know is this. Half the reason why your team that was Denial, basically the same exact players, became the first Team Liquid squad in CSGO. There's a very good reason if people don't know, which is when you went to the ESEA Invite LAN, you were beating like real team like Cloud9 with Sean Gares and going at, like further than people expected and showing that like there was potential here. And so even though I will say like some of the fact Team Liquid came in was just esports stuff. If people doesn't know, that was the year when all the big LCS teams came in, TSM, obviously got the Danish lineup, CLG had their lineup of the guys who were the, what they called, fucking mouse spars or whatever they were called back then. But there's a good reason your team got picked up. Like your team was already basically shaking shit up, and even if you hadn't been in Team Liquid, was probably already like second or third best NA roster, right?
Yeah, I'd say back then the only team we really couldn't beat was iBuyPower at the time because they were just
they had all the, it was like an all-star team of players as well, wasn't it? Yeah,
player in full form, and we were very inexperienced. Like the first international LAN we went to was that ESEA LAN you're talking about, where we played Titan first, I believe, and then we played Elevate, and then we played Cloud9.
Yes,
and then I forget who we lost.
And iBuyPower after that.
Yeah, iBuyPower. So yeah, that was like, I think most of us on that team kind of agreed that was like the start of our careers. And that propelled us to like even getting picked up, was beating Cloud9. That was like a big win for all 5 of us for sure.
Here's the thing,
since they call us onliners all the time.
Oh, I've no doubt, yeah, of course. Yeah, the other thing about this era as well, actually, that's a perfect segue, by the way, is in this era, people will know, but right before your team and then Cloud9 themselves brought in some of the newer players like the Skadoodles and Shrouds of the world, right? Before this, the perception in NA was it's iBuyPower, Cloud9, and who gives a shit about the rest, right? Like all they did is flame you guys, and I'll tell you, every LAN I ever went to, they all just told me that the reason why we're not that good is because all the other teams are just shit in practice and they know what they're doing and they're all idiots and don't know how the meta works. And then they would go to these lands and maybe lose to you guys. Like, and what I was going to ask was this: even though now you've done so many more things in your career, you've been in semi-finals of majors and all sorts of stuff, right? When you look back at this point in time, it is a bit, when you have a big upset win like that, I bet it was everything at the time, right? I bet that was like a super interesting memory.
Yeah, I mean, I even talked about it with NAF like recently. It's like that was like literally like the start of our careers. Like that was like, it just, when new players get a win off a team that's doing well, or they never even thought they could beat, it really just gives you this unspeakable confidence, essentially. Like, you can actually do this. Like, these guys aren't that far ahead of you as you like once thought, essentially.
What about, since obviously some of the players on that team people will know, like obviously people like Nitro did a lot since then, but the question I would ask you is this: who was young NAF? Because this is NAF, remember, we're talking, if people don't know, but later 2014, this is way before NAF even won the ELEAGUE and all that stuff later. He must have been really young at the time, right? Yeah,
I think he was 17 when I played with him, like first. And I mean, I even like played pugs with him and stuff in Source. He's always just been young, and now he's 26, so it's pretty funny. But like back then, he, it wasn't really a career yet. He was definitely sort of not putting the time in that, like,
a bit of a slacker.
Should play. Yeah, like he'd play League of Legends all the time, and
okay,
that was like, I mean, this is public knowledge, but this is like one of the main reasons he got cut from Liquid initially for ELEAGUE, was just because it didn't really seem like he cared that much back then. And I think that like getting replaced when you're in that mindset is a good thing for your future, because it just gives you a wake-up call.
And I'm sure, even without knowing necessarily, like if that's one of the factors, ELEAGUE is the guy who's like on a roll type nerd guy who just does everything that he's supposed to do. So I'd imagine if it was a 1-for-1 in that sense, ELEAGUE probably killed it in that regard. Turn up to every practice, isn't playing League of Legends instead when you want him practicing.
I mean, ELEAGUE was like, it was funny because we were picking him up at the ClutchCon we went to in 2015.
Oh, okay.
And I remember he was really into StarCraft and loved Liquid. And I remember we sat down and talked with him in the lobby at that LAN, and he had a little Liquid sticker on his phone case before he was even picked up. And it was just kind of like the perfect fit back then in terms of like how motivated he was.
How did it work in that team though? Like that when the initial lineup was set, like it was you and adreN, and obviously adreN himself has not only later been a coach, but he's an IGL figure. How did that like get divided up? Like how can you coexist together?
I mean, honestly, when we picked up adreN, it was kind of surreal because like I wasn't really anybody in Source, but adreN was like one of the best players in Source, 100%. I was like, I'm IGLing this guy. Like, what the fuck is happening here? And I'd say like I definitely did not know how to call at all back then. I was just calling like 4-1s and scrimmy shit.
Right.
I didn't really understand the game at all, to be honest. And I think adreN helped me a decent amount in terms of like learning how to default properly and things like that, which did help my calling in the future.
Right. One thing that I always wondered about was What was the exact like dynamic of how your period in Team Liquid ended at this point in time? Because if people don't know, this roster that was the Denial Squad came over, but as you said, it's not like it was just you. Naf ended up out of the lineup and had to come back years later. Obviously, you went off elsewhere. Like, if I look at the results, here's the thing, mate. Yeah, they weren't great in Team Liquid, but like they weren't great after you as well, mate. It took them a solid while. Basically, until they got simple the year later, they weren't doing shit themselves on big lands. They weren't like an international team that's mixing it up and going like playoffs. They also were sort of. So I wondered, like, what was the criteria? Was it like an internal thing? Like, I know back then players obviously had more power. Did the players just choose to kick you essentially? What happened?
It was just I couldn't really handle. I'd say like all of us kind of felt the pressure of getting like our first contract of being paid. I think I didn't handle it as well as others may have, and I also back then when you go from like not really getting attention to getting like if you remember the CSGO lounge days, I'd get like if we lost a game, I'd get like 10 death threats.
Oh,
instantly.
no doubt, yeah.
CSGO lounge was vicious back then, like way worse than it is now. And back then, I wasn't trained to like handle that kind of stuff, and that kind of mentally affected me in game, and definitely affected my calling. And that was one of the main reasons I got replaced, because like I just had trouble focusing on like my responsibilities of what I had to do, and then the pressure in game, and you know, representing one of the biggest esports brands back then as well, from like StarCraft. So that was like the main reason I got replaced. And I mean, everyone was kind of dealing with that since we were all new players, essentially, just trying to handle that pressure.
Thing is, though, to me, and again, a lot of people won't know these stories, is why it's cool we're doing the interview. To me, you actually got the ultimate revenge, because to me, when you went to that CEVO with the Conquest lineup, with Shazam and fucking Stanislaw and those guys, basically a bunch of other players around that the OP group, you guys not only got out of groups, but you did so at the expense of Team Liquid, and if people remember, like a pretty decent Dignitas squad. It was one with MSL, with AZ before he left, and went all that. Or maybe this was actually maybe after he'd just been signed to the other team, I forget which it was, but like this was like a nice little run, like you had a semis run. This is when Mouse was still a good team. That must have been nice to place ahead of Liquid in that sense, right?
Yeah, it's. I mean, I've been cut from a couple teams, and anytime I get revenge on them, it's definitely a good feeling. I do remember that CEVO land though, because we were playing Mouse and we won pistol. No, we should have beat them, but I remember there was this huge drama about how we won pistol, but Gobby's monitor was turned off.
Okay.
And he had to look on his teammate's monitor to like in a 1 versus 3 on pistol.
Okay.
Or something like that. And then they keep pressuring us to restart the round and saying like how we'll be remembered for like our good nature. But like the good like the rule now is if damage is done, the round's played out.
Yeah.
But like we were just getting pressured by admins to like essentially restart the round, and then I think we started the match down 7-0 after that.
Oh,
after we
right,
won
I see
pistol.
what you mean.
And it like obviously we still could have lost, but it just kind of like put a bad taste in our mouths. In respect to Shazam, because Shazam didn't want to like do it at all, but it was that was a good little run for sure.
Sure. Right. The question I have is this. Did you actually think when OpTic came calling? Because to me, right, I'm not from COD, and obviously, like, console games aren't my thing. So to me, like, even though Team Liquid, it's not like, look, outside of League of Legends, if people don't know, like, in StarCraft, they were known as, it's not like they were the one that had the best teams. It was Evil Geniuses that had all the best StarCraft players. Right, to me, I never thought OpTic was that legendary because I'm not from console games. But I know in America, like, that's as big as all these other teams. That's as big as Team Liquid and Evil Geniuses. Like, it's a big deal when they come in the game. Because I remember when people told me, like, OpTic's coming, and I was like, does it even matter? Is there any overlap? But all I remember is this stat Daps. I remember at ESL1 Cologne, so this is well before, if people don't know, like the superstar lineup you're all thinking of with OpTic. This is when they were still building the squad up. I remember there was that stat where it showed the sticker sales, and on the sticker sales, like FaZe, who also obviously comes from the Call of Duty type world, FaZe was like 2.5 times whoever was second. I think second was OpTic, and then the rest was like, you know, like normal teams like Fnatic or whatever, right? But I remember at this major, like FaZe and OpTic were like out in the group stage, and I was like, wait, is the fan base that big that everyone's just by? Because essentially what I didn't realize that's genius is, if you are just generally a fan of OpTic and you happen to play CS, you're going to get the skin, just have the OpTic logo on your gun or whatever. Like, there actually was a logic that I didn't understand. Like, I thought, what's the overlap going to be between console and PC? So when OpTic came, right, was it actually a big deal to get that contract and to be like building this squad with them, etc.? Because I couldn't have known it at the time, but it ended up being a pretty big deal in esports, right?
I mean, as someone who played like COD console during high school, it was a big deal, 100%. Even just from my perspective, and everyone on the team played Call of Duty on console
All
as well
right.
at some point. So like, we knew how big the brand was, at least from our perspective. And I remember even when we joined, that's the biggest gain in followers I've ever had from any org I've joined ever.
Right.
I think we gained like 15,000 or 20,000 in like a day and a half.
Yeah, that's the other thing I underestimated, dude. It is real. Like, those fans will just follow everyone who joins OpTic and sort of support you in a fucked up way, right?
Yeah, so like the support from the org was insane, like out the gate. And obviously like OpTic wasn't as big like organizationally back then. It was definitely more bare bones, but in terms of the support and the following we got from it, it was worth it 100%.
Like, it's funny because the actual, if people don't know, believe it or not, my burn on Shaq is more famous than the match that took place at that event. People forget, I wasn't just on Inside the NBA for no reason. We were at Vegas CES to do this match, which was obviously like Lounge Gaming, which was those Polish guys that you might remember if everyone remembers them. And obviously this OpTic team, that you were the guys playing for the last spot in ELEAGUE. This was like the last one. And obviously winning this got you into ELEAGUE. Because I've often thought that. People don't bother going back and thinking, Daps. One, a lot of people actually thought the Polish team was going to win that match. And then two, getting into ELEAGUE is what eventually allowed the team later down the line to win ELEAGUE. Like, there would probably never would have been that. If people remember, ELEAGUE was one of those things where it was like Blast. It was like teams, it was partner orgs. And if you weren't in, you weren't in. So, like, that actually ended up being a pretty meaningful match, right?
Yeah, and I think the prize money was pretty good too. It was a one best of 3 for 35K for first place. That's like winning a minor back then, or like a GMAC Open.
Plus, in the position you're in, you know, you hadn't had that many years at the top. That you're going to be on TV is a pretty big deal. American TV.
I mean, we were literally warming up, and like Shaq, Barkley, and Mark Cuban are behind us, watching us warm up. I'm like, what the fuck is happening here? I'm like, this is surreal. I was like in shock. And like, even I got messages from people I hadn't talked to in like 6 years, messaging me like, "Oh, you're on TV. That's crazy." So it was a pretty surreal moment for all of us.
You know, dude, that's one of those ones where people get too jaded because of esports. Like, we all know everyone in esports. But I've even said this story, mate. I never get starstruck by anyone. But I can't lie. When Charles Barkley walked up to me, he was like, "Oh, hello, Thorin." I was spiraling a bit, like, what the fuck? Like, it just feels too surreal, doesn't it? I know. It's too much.
Yeah, it didn't feel real, for sure. Even like X Games. X Games is an event that gets overlooked a lot. But that event was ahead of its time, in my opinion. And just like, you get to meet all the people from Jackass, and you're just wild, you're in this like player lounge with like all these pro snowboarders like Shaun White and stuff. I'm like, what is happening here?
Oh,
they just see just a bunch of nerds. Like, what are these guys doing here?
The only thing, one thing I want to ask about the OpTic experience, though, is I know part of it's a meme, but part of it is like Hex, who was obviously the main figure, like the figurehead of OpTic. He always did used to stress for the CSGO lineup that whole like trust the process type jazz that everyone knows now from the NBA and the 76ers or whatever. Like, but his whole philosophy was the idea that you don't just build like the championship team in one day. You sort of have to go piece by piece, and you sort of figure out through the tournaments who the right people are. Was that a real thing? Was there actually like a concept behind how OpTic was built? Because it does seem like it went piece by piece and eventually got really good.
Yeah, I'd say that's definitely his philosophy. Because I remember also one thing he said was, you know, if you guys are winning, then I don't care if you do content, but if you're not winning, I expect you to do content. Because that's another thing he pushed for, was like, he was super big into content, helping us build our brands and stuff. And in terms of the roster, I mean, he gave me majority control. Like, there was like, he wasn't very involved in terms of that kind of stuff. Because I even when I wanted to pick up Mixwell, he didn't get a visa, so I had to like bring him to Canada, and he lived in my house for like 2 months.
Okay.
In my parents' house, like my mom bringing him food in the basement type stuff. So it's like, he definitely like gave me full control, and I like that when owners kind of like let me, you know, fall on my sword if I need to, instead of, you know, micromanaging it.
What about, obviously, let's do the segue and talk about Mixwell. What was it about Mixwell, by the way, made this the player to pick up? Because I'll tell you right now, mate, I watched all of European CSGO. Look, the eye test was he was all right on a Spanish team. Like, yeah, maybe there's some potential there. I wouldn't like put it this way, you guys brought him over like fucking Team Liquid brought Simple, mate. Like, I understand that gimbal. If it works, you go to the top. Like, what did you see in this player? Because obviously you must have seen something that the rest of us weren't. What did you see about him, Mixwell?
I mean, we were looking for an opper, and when we assessed like all our North American opping options, we're just like, I remember talking to Hex and the team, and it's, you know, I just said we're not really going to go that far picking up any of the options we had. I don't remember many of them, but when I was looking like through, I remember I messaged the Peter guy from HLTV, and he just gave me like a list of like 30 European players, and I just went through each player and watched their demos.
Okay.
And when I got like my sort of short list, I wish I remembered the short list, but I got like a list of 5 names.
It's a shame you don't remember them, because that was going to be a question. I'm almost certain from the stories over the years, there was a couple on there who did become like amazing players later, but I just can't remember who they were, if you know what I mean. Like, fuck,
yeah.
Was like Oscar or someone on there? There was someone else who became like really good, I'm telling you, if people don't know.
It came between Oscar and Mixwell, but Oscar didn't want to move.
There you go. I knew there was someone who actually later, like, it's one of those ones that if you could have done it, would have been banger. Yeah.
I think Oscar was our first option, but he didn't want to move because of family, I'm pretty sure.
Makes sense.
But Mixwell, he was like a little more unknown, and when I did more research, I watched like his stream to see kind of his personality, and you know, he was kind of like a little bit of a tilter, but he seemed like super motivated, played all the time. Like he just had this like balls. Like he was a player who would just get in there and get the job done. Is like the main thing we took from it. And Shazam back then, at least, or like replacing Shazam. Shazam was also like pretty ballsy and like would get in there and get the job done. So we kind of wanted to keep that style for our team. And Mixwell also was a really good rifler too, because he wasn't even a main opper. We turned him into a main opper. So we liked having that hybrid approach, because back then I still called pretty scrimmy, so there'd be a lot of times where we wouldn't have an op either. So that's kind of like the main. And then I interviewed him after we decided, and then Hex got the job done, helping with like flights and stuff.
Yeah, that's actually an interesting thing you say, because I even remember famously he would sometimes himself mention, I think it was in social media or in an interview or somewhere, I remember him mentioning something like maybe he shouldn't be the opera, or like maybe I'll stop doing it or whatever. It's like, what? Like, you're doing a really good job. I also got the vibe with him, by the way, that he's someone where like he's not like a super selfish player, right? Like he seemed like he's pretty fine, like giving up roles or swapping over to other things. He's more, isn't he, accommodating type guy?
Yeah, I wouldn't say he's like full accommodating, but he definitely, you know, he would do what the team needs. And, you know, if we had good logic for putting him in certain positions, and he would do it.
One thing I want to ask, a bit like the adreN question earlier, is how in the Conquest team, in this team, how was Stanislaw a player but not the IGL? Because for whatever reason, he himself after this, like the joke is he always replaced you in the teams, but he became an IGL himself after this. How did it work before? Was he really not at all an IGL in these teams when he was playing with you? He's just a player.
He was like, we just had, yeah. So like the Stanislaw story is kind of just like, he was the IGL of Coast, I think. I think Coast was a team. We picked him up from that team. He was the IGL of that team, and I just wanted someone who had a second voice on the team, and we ended up picking him up. He was like the main lurker, but then obviously Naf is very lurky, so there was like a lot of role conflict. I know Stanislaw didn't like that Naf ended up lurking more than him a lot of the time, because Stanislaw's always been like super passive player.
Yes.
Like never going first. So that was sort of that, and he didn't talk that much, I'd say. Like when we got TaRiK for like the 2 weeks I was there, TaRiK definitely talked more than Stan did when I was calling. I'm not sure if he didn't talk as much because he was unhappy with like the roles and things like that, but yeah, he turned into an IGL again after, but he was an IGL when we picked him up though. Yeah.
Oh, and he just gave up the role to you, right?
Yeah, he gave it, yeah, and then he wanted the IGL when like we were having our like, I mean, we were gonna cut 3 different people. I've told the story many times, but you know, it was gonna be Naf was the first person gonna get cut from OpTic, and then it was gonna be Stanislaw, and then they decided to cut me. And like, to be fair, all three of us deserved to be cut in our own right.
Ah, there's a compelling reason for each person.
Yeah. So
what was the reason for you?
I definitely still didn't call very well on OpTic, in my opinion. I think on NRG is where I finally like figured it out. I also just like individually wasn't that good, and I think Tarik's opinion was just sort of like, if my calling's not that good, just get the guy who is killing people a little bit more, even though the roles are different.
The only thing is, though, I will say, if I look at the mix of players you had in this era compared to later eras, you also had some players that aren't like the easiest players to fucking call for, mate. Like, if people don't know, Shazam's pretty much like, you said it politely, he's just going to do whatever he wants in the game. He's going to take any crazy peek he wants. Naf, like you say, is very idiosyncratic player. He's just going to lurk forever, be wherever he is on the map. Like, these aren't exactly like just pieces you put anywhere, Like, they're tricky players to work with, right?
Yeah, because I think with Shazam, at least, I think there was an issue like Sean Gares had with Shazam on Cloud9 was because, I think they probably criticized him a lot more than we did, whereas
Right.
we were definitely a more open team and I'd say a little more puggy, where Shazam could do more of what he wants without the like fear or repercussions that would come after it. So that maybe made him play better because he just didn't have that pressure hanging over him.
By the way, I could just be totally off base on this, but based on some of the things I've known from knowing people like Semfis and some of the different teams they were in, isn't it also sort of like a Canadian style of play to play a bit poggy though? Like I've seen it tends to, if people don't know, a lot of those teams tend to just be like, it's like they're like the upset merchants. It's people just playing like a bit free for all and just see what happens.
I don't know if it's a Canadian thing per se.
Fair enough.
I think it was just me being a not great IGL
Okay.
back then, to be honest.
Fair enough.
Because I mean, I just kind of, I had this issue too back then where we'd almost be winning a match or it'd be like 15-13 or whatever, and I'd be like, let's just rush, like let's just get it over with. And it's like, and then I pulled that back eventually and learned from my mistakes, and I went more of the like let's bleed them out slowly approach instead of just like trying to get it over with, even if they're on eco. Because I threw a couple games calling that way, just trying to force it to end.
When, like, if you think about the order of the career so far, so you had like the bump from Denial, you get into Team Liquid. Team Liquid's a big org, a few months in, that goes away. You go back, you work your way back again. This time you do it with Conquest, you get into OpTic. It's getting again to like similar level, like we're almost making it. Like this time we're at majors now, this is a big deal. You get caught again. Are you not someone who, does that not set you back? Do you not feel like a morale drop if you get kicked out of a team like that? You really just go to the grindstone again?
I mean, if I was being cut for absolutely zero reason, then that would probably affect me more. But I understood the issues I had, and it helped me grow to be better on the next team. And I also, on the OpTic team, like they ended up winning ELEAGUE, but to be honest, that team had a lot of issues, and I wasn't that upset being cut from OpTic, to be honest. Like it was actually more of a blessing in disguise for me, because I got to just start a new project, get some new players, and I did honestly, like, even though I don't want to be cut and I'd rather just stay there and like change players within that team, I do enjoy like the team building process. So it wasn't really like a setback at all. It honestly helped me further in my career, so I wasn't upset getting cut from OpTic.
Because the funny thing is, when we then talk about when you went to NRG, it's going to sound like, you know, it's in people's brains. You always in your brain go to the best version of those teams. And they're all going to think, oh, it's a big team against big org. Like, if people don't know, NRG, the actual esports org, wasn't that huge back then. It's actually when they were sort of getting going and building themselves up to being big. And even then, they're mainly known for games like Overwatch, etc. Like, they're not really, this actually was the one big time in a major game outside. So, like, this ended up being a really good squad. And at the end, when he left it, he'd done amazing things. But I remember the first version of that team was way more like a Denial type lineup. Like it was a fucking FugLy and PTR. Who, remember, guys, like this was years removed from when he did all the fucking shit in CLG. Like it was actually just like whoever's left over in the NA scene in a way, right? What was this team like? How did this lineup end up being the initial NRG roster? Because obviously, like I'm saying, later on it gets a lot better, but the first lineup was a bit dodgy.
The start of NRG in 2017, that was just kind of like working with what I have, essentially. Like there wasn't many options back then, and NRG wasn't really like down to do too much.
I'm
at
imagining
the
they were
time.
just putting their toes into CSGO, right? They weren't like committed fully.
Yeah,
I'm guessing,
because they
right?
had like the Gobby, Tabs, and
Oh, that's
NRG
right. Yes, they
before
did. They
that.
had that hybrid lineup, didn't they? Yeah.
Yeah, and then that didn't work out. And then PTR, like he was statistically really good, especially online. And kind of my philosophy with like building the team was let's just like qualify for lands first, and then we'll like build it slowly. Because the one thing that I loved with NRG and like Andy was he was willing to like give me time and
Oh,
just
okay.
like work the kinks out. You know, we don't need to win right now. We don't need to like get top 4 right now. Like let's just put this lineup together. We'll see all the issues, and then over time we'll like make it better. And that's exactly what we did. And 2017 was just literally a testing period of just figuring it out, trying to find what players would be good, which players are not. And then at the end of the year we can maybe do some buyouts. And I do remember we picked up CeRq first, I think. Yeah, we picked up CeRq in A and J, and CeRq was like pretty obvious pickup at the time, in my opinion. It wasn't like the mixwell pickup. And after getting CeRq, I wanted to quit, so I went to coaching for like 1 event, I think, or 2 events. And I wasn't even coaching. I was just like there as like a manager, kind of, because I wasn't even gonna continue anymore. And then I got this like rejuvenation of just like I want to play again, and I had this crazy motivation and kind of like an epiphany of like how to approach things differently, like focusing more on like individuals rather than just like I always kind of looked at the team as a whole too much rather than just like trying to make each individual player better, which then just makes the team better. And I would like talk about helping players like make routines to like be more consistent, and just I was kind of trying to think outside the box a little more rather than just like CS. And that's where after 2017 ended, I went to Andy and I pretty much told him it was like a kind of a little bit of a battle to buy Ethan from CLG, I believe. But I pretty much said like, if you guys aren't willing to buy Ethan, then you should just sell us to a different organization. Because like if you're not gonna buy Ethan, then we're not like serious about winning, is what I told Andy. And Andy's like, okay, we're buying him. And Ethan was obviously insane back then. So that was sort of like the start of that really good lineup.
Thing is, though, I always wondered that we can do both the players at the same time on both CeRq and Ethan. The thing is, though, like this is one of the lineups where from the outside, I would have given you quite a lot of credit, mate, because when CeRq was like, you're right, he was a prospect in Europe. People already knew. The thing is obviously Bulgarian. So back then there was a lot more national teams. Therefore, there wasn't like a million mouse spots type teams you could join. There was a couple. And even then, you probably had to still be a big name already in Europe. That was the only issue for someone like him. But I agree. Like, I mean, if people don't know, basically he was already going to end up in like a Hellraiser's type squad long term going forwards anyway. Like there would have been some team would have picked him up. So I agree that he definitely was going to be known anyway. But I remember when he came into your lineup, it did look actually like you guys did a very good job, like setting him up and like having like someone be like next to. Like it looked to me like you almost did some old school stuff in Counter-Strike. Where if people don't know, a classic thing you do on CT side, for example, with an AWPer, is if you just want them to be comfy, you just essentially have someone sort of bodyguard them. Like you sit there and just always watch his off angle or make sure no one can flank him, and then the guy just gets cut. He can just peek a million times, take all his shots, figure it out. Am I just speculating? It looked like you set him up, and similar with Ethan to me. Ethan, if eye test wise in CLG, obviously had amazing aim, but I always thought as a player, maybe he hadn't developed as a player, maybe he didn't know his role yet. A lot of international players and just playing basic CS, it's like making decisions and stuff. It seemed like he did a very good job, sort of like positioning these guys to develop and become the stars they did. Am I right?
I'd say at the very, very start, like before we had Chet, it was definitely like more puggy, and definitely like I definitely based the team around CeRq completely, because he was our main prospect at the time, and just like his play style kind of needed him to be set up, especially on T side. Like he's not like a support operator. He's gonna hold flashes for me every round, which is what he eventually got turned into like after I was gone. So I kind of knew like what I needed to do to get the most out of him. And then Ethan individually was really good, but he had a lot to learn at the time because he eventually became like my second-hand man, their second IGL on the team.
Right.
But early on, like Ethan struggled a lot in terms of like calling, but he I respect his work ethic because he was like very persistent, and like no matter how much he was wrong at the start, he just kept trying to make calls and try and like learn, and then he eventually turned into like a good second IGL. But overall, yeah, I set up the main players that were set up was Brehze, CeRq, and then Ethan was third, and then me and FugLy were just like the bitch rolls pretty much.
And then also, I've got to obviously ask, like you say, about Brehze, because if people don't know about the only thing he was famous for, it's why it's wild you had him and Marky at the beginning, was people thought maybe he just cheated online. Like, and here's the fucked up thing as well, Daps. I even remember the clips people were posting. And the problem is this, it's a bit like that famous thing of like, well, of course everyone thought like Simple Aussie we were cheating when they were like nobodies. They actually are as better than cheaters. Like, the joke is, if people remember some of the clips being posted, well, obviously Brehze did turn out to have some of the best spray probably ever in Counter-Strike. Like, it's no wonder he looked cracked, but was that never a concern for you? I know it was a little bit of drama at the time of people like, oh, should they be picking this guy up, or is he suspect? Was it ever a concern?
I mean, I watched the clips. I mean, there's like such a low chance. There's clips of players that looked like they were cheating way more than what he was doing, honestly. So like, just comparatively, like if I'm taking the risk in the position I'm in. Like, I'm not gonna pass this guy up for like the 10% chance he's cheating.
Fair enough.
So I mean, and a lot of players that end up being the best, like people called Rops a cheater, people called Zywu a cheater. So I mean, the people that get called cheaters usually end up being really good. So just works that way.
Indeed. Right. What about this then? Because the thing people will forget, they always do get the years mixed up, mate, is it was a while before NRG really got going. Like, even these lineups, when you were bringing the pieces in one by one, it took a while before the international results started coming. A lot of people might not know this, but most of your international results before this were always on NA soil. It was like when the Euros came to you get the upset win, or you go a bit further. It's a big deal, right? When you fight, especially as a leader, to finally get like some actual top places and feel like you're in the mix in a European tournament, right?
Yeah, you just feel like you belong there, especially after the first like big result we had was the Star Ladder, I think.
I think so, yeah.
We got second place, and we played Na'Vi in the final. I remember that. Yeah, that was like the first event where, like I kind of said earlier, the amount of confidence like the young players on my team got from that, it's like, okay, we deserve to be here now. Like 100%, especially beating Liquid too in the quarterfinals. That was probably bigger than even making the final.
If people don't remember, that was the one where the bracket was supposed to be like, oh, Liquid gets to go to the final for easy, and they didn't even win the first match because you guys played them immediately, didn't you?
Yeah, I like to bring that match up to NAF a lot.
Okay.
But yeah, it was like that was like the biggest match, I think, for the five of us to start, a good streak of consistency. Just because, beating the best team in the region just tells you everything. And then we got kind of fucked in the final. Like, Na'Vi probably would have beat us anyway, but we played the first semifinal at the beginning of the day, and then had to wait 8 hours for the final, and then they got to play right before the final. So we were just dead tired at the final. And we had zero chance, honestly.
By the way, since this time period is, like you say, when you got Chet, Imapet came in as the coach and became like another figure in your teams especially, right? Give me an update based on what you said earlier. Was this the team where you started to get good at calling, in your opinion? Was he involved in it? How did you two work as a kind of a duo? Because it seems like all the teams you've been in have had pretty good success.
I mean, I'd say I had like some work ethic issues probably before. Like I'd put time in, but I wouldn't like grind demos. Chet is literally like a grinder of demos. Like he could do 12 hours of demos in one day. So like he really got me onto like he helped me with like prepping for teams. Like he taught me a lot about prepping for teams and showing like his system of doing it, like what to look for. Because like when I prep for teams, it was not nearly as good, to be honest. So like me and Chet, literally every day at almost every event, we'd be in the prac room till 2-3 a.m. doing prep. Everyone's already went to bed, and we would just be constantly trying to like update our game, take things. We took probably almost everything from Astralis during that time period, and then like changed little things about it to make it our own game, which is why we honestly liked playing Astralis, because we felt like we knew everything they did, because we were just like kind of a carbon copy of them to some extent.
One thing I wanted to ask was, even though at this point in time, like you've been in an international final, like you say at StarLadder, you've beaten some of the best teams in the world on LAN, you've been through all these different lineups. At the time, you were in that unfortunate position. Like you'd only played, I think it's like the one, was it just Cologne with OpTic? You'd played like one major or something, right? Like you were always the team that was just failing to qualify. Even this NRG lineup, despite all the success, wasn't getting to the major. Like that has to sort of fuck with you a bit, because as much as we all want to tell each other there's more to the circuit than the majors, mate, I can tell you, even as talent, you get FOMO like a motherfucker if you're not there. Like, even if I turn the gig down, mate, when I'm not there, I'm still sort of like, shit, it is the major, though. Like, I'm going to be watching for the next 3 weeks. Like, it's a big deal.
It's a big deal, but honestly, my mindset was just like, if I'm at like a Cologne that's not a major and all the good teams are there, the event to me still mattered the same, personally. Because like, if I'm winning an event and all the best teams are there, it's a major. It's like the same. Like, obviously it's not run by Valve, but and I don't get a little like thing on my Steam profile. Like, the biggest thing that sucks on being the major is not getting sticker money. That's honestly,
true. Yeah,
that's honestly the biggest blow. But I didn't really have that. I understand why people do have the mindset of like, especially for this last CSGO major that's about to happen, like winning the last CSGO major, that's like a huge thing. But for me, every event that every good team was at mattered just as much, for me at least.
What was it like when you actually started to get these results? Was the org already on board with it? Like, was it not a problem for them? If you're not at a major, that's kind of like the World Championship, right?
They're not okay with it, just because obviously they get a lot of revenue from stickers. But NRG was like one of the best orgs I've been in, just because, you know, they gave us so much freedom and space and just let us do our thing, and they never interfered with anything, and they pretty much just anything we needed, they got it for us. And they, you know, there'd be sometimes they'd message us like, oh, what's going on, like, why are we losing like this match, blah blah blah, but like that's just normal, you know.
Okay. One player I wanted to ask about, because he unfortunately wasn't a big star name, so he gets forgotten in all these teams, is obviously in this lineup and the original denial and Team Liquid, you played with FugLy for a whole bunch of your career. And this was a player where, in the denial squad, look, that was just a bunch of players and people were all trying to frag, and like you say, he played a bit poggy. But I noticed in this NRG squad, it felt like he very much did become like a supportive element, and he had his set spots, and he clearly wasn't supposed to be like a fragger, right? Like, it seemed like he did his job. What's your relationship with him be like? Seemed like you always get along with him?
I mean, with FugLy, he's a player where like he doesn't do too much in terms of like going for plays and stuff, but he added that nice balance to the team, because he's a player where like on overpass he'll just sit blue door and he'll just always be there. Like, he won't die. He's not like necessarily a positive in terms of getting something done, but he's also not dead. So like I can rely on that, and it added like consistency to our game, because I always knew what position he's gonna be in, and then that let CeRq, Brehze, Ethan, and myself do whatever the fuck we wanted. So even though I think later on in the team where we got like top 4 in the world or top 3 in the world, that part of his game was holding us back, in my opinion. Early on, it gave us like a lot of stability, because he just kind of just sat there and was a consistent piece on both sides.
Because, I mean, to me, it's totally understandable that tarik comes in and replaces him. It's worth the gamble at that point. But also, I want to ask you this, which is, to me, this is actually when also tarik started to sort of change his roles up. And like, if the tarik that joined OpTic, for example, he was a star player. Like, he was a guy who, like, I mean, I think he was the MVP when Cloud9 won that major, as far as I'm concerned. He was a very good player. It felt like this era of NRG going into EG later was when he became more of a supportive element of the team himself, or maybe like let the young guys be the stars. What would you say on that role? Because I always thought this was an interesting pickup, because it wasn't like you just picked him up to be the top fragger, right?
The main reason we picked him up was, well, we had like a list of 8 players, and most of them fell through. Like, we tried to go for Stewie before Liquid did,
right?
But obviously Stewie's going to go with Liquid at the time over us. And then there's a few other players that we tried to get, but they were like European and would just rather stay. I think huNter was one of them.
Oh, that would be interesting. Okay,
but huNter wanted to stay, and he was like really young back then. I do remember. I'm pretty sure I talked to him. And then Storm was one of them, but he was super inexperienced back then. Like, not even like. So it came down to tarik, and the main reason was just because he's like second IGL, and you know, for most of NRG with FugLy, it was just Ethan and I talking in terms of calling. So we had a lot of like micromanaging to do, and we felt that if we had like a third voice, it would help balance it out a little bit more. And you know, CeRq also wasn't like a bad frag or anything back then either. Like he would hold his own. So overall, it was like it was a pickup we had to do, because at the end it was between, after we like went through our list of players, it was between CeRq and Psalm, and you know, we had to go with CeRq at that point.
The Beatles said they get by with a little help from their friends, but I get by with a little help from my Patreon community. And this video was kindly supported by Matt Pugnaccio Racula, Ahmed Haju, Bot Pounder 420, Toucan, Animosity, Tobias Bernasconi, Jensen Gore, Tosh, and a special thanks always goes out to my main man, Jerky's Minion. Would you like to ask me a question in my monthly video AMA? Do you want teasers to find out who are the upcoming guests? Maybe you want to take part in one of those lengthy but intense esports discussions I have with my donators, or maybe you want to suggest a guest or a topic that I could cover. Well, if any of those tickle your fancy, put your money where your mouth is and join the Skrilluminati today, where in the description box below there is a Patreon link.